Welcome back to the Historical Movies Podcast, the podcast about historically inspired movies. I'm Ross Evans, I'm an editor, and I'm joined by Professor of Modern History at Liverpool Hope University and historical scriptwriter, Bryce Evans. Bonjour, Bryce.
Bonjour.
Because in today's episode, we're going back to 1966 for a cult classic, The Battle of Algiers. Directed by Gillo Pontecorvo, a Italian-Algerian production. Bryce, this movie starts, or at least the version I watched started, by telling you what awards it had won. The Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival, 1966, and the International Film Critics Award, 1966. It's fair to say this is a venerated classic of the genre, a Sude's favourite, a classic of cinema, 99% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it's a classic movie, and I have to say, of course, I thoroughly enjoyed it. We'll get onto the history a bit later. We'll talk firstly about our views on it and what we thought the main points of the film were, and then listeners will get onto our list of questions we ask of every film towards the end. But the first thing that struck me, Bryce, watching this movie is that because it's a series of vignettes, basically, we get these little insights into the history of the Battle of Algiers in the mid-50s. It reminded me of our chat during the Titanic episode, which you should go and listen to, listeners, if you haven't heard it. When we talked about the film A Night to Remember, made in the 50s, 1958 that was made, versus Titanic. And A Night to Remember follows the Titanic sinking in a series of vignettes, with no real main character. Whereas Titanic, as we all know, features Jack and Rose classic Hollywood fare. And this movie, with its sort of documentary style, focusing on little vignettes of historical actions, guerrilla warfare, and so on, no particular main character, I was thinking, is this the antidote? Are these type of old-fashioned movies the antidote to the standard Hollywood model of movie making that we see these days, where you have to sympathize with the main character? We have this high pitch, as we've talked about before, of good versus evil. Is this the antidote to that filmmaking?
I think it is, and I think it's highly significant, of course, that Pontecorvo was coming from a Marxist background, and in that way it is very much the anti-great man school of history. There isn't really a main character. Perhaps you could say Mathieu, the French commander, is a key character. But really, this section, just to preempt, when you come to me and say, who's your favourite character, I was going to say all of them. Because that's the strength of the movie, isn't it? Multiple main characters. Yeah. It's an ensemble. You have the crowd and all their ululating glory. And every character, this is the great thing about this movie, every character is at the mercy of broader factors. So for me, I love that. I love that approach. I know it doesn't always work, depends on the movie, but in conveying a sort of slice of history like this, a process of decolonization, I think it's highly effective. And of course, so many movies have come in after this, where it's probably quite easy to slip into idle platitudes about this movie, but there's so much here that is for its time revolutionary. And I think it's highly significant that it's made by people who are coming from a left-wing perspective, from a perspective of having been through the war as Marxists and partisans. And that, I think, shows in the approach to the movie, in the non-great man, the non-main character approach.
Yeah, two things that, just listening to you talk there, brought up in my mind. The first thing we should mention is the way this film is shot, which really was revolutionarily realistic in 1966 when it was made in that documentary style with that newsreel voiceover that's intercut in certain sections of the movie. Plus, you've got these wonderful camera angles shot in the real Casbah of Algiers, where you're just completely immersed within, as people walking in front of the screen. It really feels like a documentary movie. I read that it had to have a disclaimer when it was shown in America that it's not actually a documentary, it's a fiction film. The second point you mentioned that I wanted to come on to was their use of non-actors and actually people who were involved in the real Battle of Algiers, notably the head of the FLN, was the real head of the FLN. And the only one actor in this movie is the general. His name?
Jean Martin.
Jean Martin, yes. The only professional actor, although he was unknown apparently when he was cast. He was a theatre actor. So it just shows you that the use of non-actors in this respect, sometimes it doesn't work in films, and in this respect, it really does. I've got a question for you though. Is it working better because we're not French speakers? We can't tell in some way, perhaps, how bad some of the acting is.
I don't think so. I think it's, again, there's so much that's come out. This style of movie making, it's, well, the sort of handheld camera kind of shtick, the sort of, modern version would be, Blair Witch Project, that kind of thing, that kind of handheld camera approach, is very raw. It's very hard hitting. Potentially there's some bad acting there because none of them, with the exception of one, are professional actors. But at the same time, I think it is at the same time a very stylized movie. In many ways, it's more. I think that sort of rawness, kind of, people get maybe a little bit hung up on that because actually it is very stylized for such a sort of raw documentary kind of approach. There's a lot of style and sort of panache in it as well, which I think sometimes gets overlooked. I was listening to another podcast. I'm not going to name names, but it was an American kind of historical movies podcast, and this is in some ways like the perfect sort of stoner movie because it's kind of it's always been shown at universities. There's always a screening of the Battle of Algiers.
Short attention span, do you mean? Or
well, no, just like this podcast I was into. It was the American sort of hippie stoners shouting on about, oh man, there's so many keys in this movie, the keys in the prison cell and the keys. And yeah, I really feel like keys are occupying such a liminal space. Everyone's carrying keys. And I feel like that with the electrodes in the torture scene, man. It's like Star Wars. Like, no. It's easy to sort of, as you say, occupy Sood's corner with this movie. But the rawness, look, this podcast on the episode is not going to be, it's not going to be perhaps as whimsical as some of the pieces we've looked at before. It's very hard to sort of...
Well, Mel Gibson's not in it for a start.
Absolutely, but we're not going to be able to entitle this the lighter side of the Battle of Algiers. Sorry, it's impossible to do that. But at the same time, it's the yes, it's the rawness, but it's very stylish as well.
Yeah, the documentary format is a style. I read a quote by Stanley Kubrick saying that every film is a mock documentary in and of itself, in some way. Every fiction film. Maybe we should get on then to the fact that this was, with the history of the decolonization of Algeria, and was, to begin with, very poorly received by French critics. They walked out of the Venice Film Festival where this won the award. The director received numerous death threats. It was banned by the French government. It was released in 1970, finally in France. But because of far-right terrorist threats, it wasn't shown until 1971. Conversely, in America, it was very well received, especially because of the feeling at that point, late 60s, going on to the 70s, about the war in Vietnam. And I've got a quote here by your friend and mine, Roger Ebert, a young Roger Ebert, writing in the Chicago Times. Maybe a deeper film experience than many audiences can withstand. Too cynical, too true, too cruel, and too heartbreaking. It is about the Algerian War, but those not interested in Algeria may substitute another war. The Battle of Algiers has a universal frame of reference. And I think this is basically where this film, we've talked about the style, the documentary style, but for me, this is where it kind of leaps off the history pages of cinema into something else, in that it carries basically with it, by not focusing on main characters that we have to sympathize with, it carries with it a much more engrossing story in many ways, which is this idea of independence. The struggle for independence is the main character in this movie in some ways. At the end of the movie... Yeah, sorry. Will
you permit me, just before you move on, to make a joke about the reception of the movie?
Yes, please. We've got to lighten the mood of this podcast.
We need the lighter side of the Battle of Algiers. While much ink has been spilled. I wrote this myself. While much ink has been spilled over this movie,
Yep.
Did you know that in Leon, somebody literally threw a pot of ink at the screen, leaving an indelible mark? Did you know that?
Leaving an indelible mark. Oh, very good. But at the screen, presumably.
Yes.
Not very good, Bryce.
Thank you.
Can I continue now, or
please
have you got any others?
No, please go on.
You've completely derailed my train of thought. I don't know where I was. I was talking about, there's a scene at the end where the guy shouts, the soldier with the megaphone shouts into the mist, "What do you want?" At the sort of visceral mist, the pervading mist that he can't get a grip on, literally and metaphorically. And it comes back, they reply, "Independence." So I suppose this movie, could you say this movie's main character is the struggle for independence?
I think you could, but I think at the same time, Pontecorvo, like I said, is a Marxist. He's a partigiano during the war, but it's not it's making it certainly. You're definitely on the side of the revolutionaries, I'd say, but it isn't a sort of didactic, preachy leftism. And I think this is illustrated by the fact that in the 90s, he went back to Algiers, saw what the place had become, kind of underlining the fact that, well-worn sort of historical reflection, all revolutions eat their children. When he returns, it's a one-party state, all the women are veiled, completely absent from the public sphere, and he was kind of disgusted at that. You do get flashes of a kind of revolutionary puritanism, I think, in the movie, which you often get in liberation movements. I think it's really powerfully put, like when all the kids attack the tramp. He's a tramp or a drunk, isn't he?
The wino, brilliant.
This sort of revolutionary puritanism, I think, comes through, and that was characteristic. There was a certain streak of that within sort of Italian communism as well. Shooting the pimps and banning drink and all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, it's not a sort of sit down and I'll tell you the great liberation story. It problematizes all its characters. It doesn't allow you really to identify with anyone to a great extent, if you see what I mean. So I mean, it's again, if I'm trying to sort of lighten the load here. I mean, everyone, when if this movie is discussed and you want to be real sued at your dinner party, you would say, well, yeah, my favorite scene is the blowing up of the milk bar, the famous scene, of course, where the women, I'm sure we'll discuss this later.
That is my favorite scene, by the way. What are you going to say?
Well, I think that it's just a wry reflection on this. It's French male the famous renowned French male horniness, which brings down their empire, isn't it? Because it's not, hey, where are you going? It's, oh, bonjour, mademoiselle, heading to the beach.
Yes.
Wink, wink. And then, no, I'm going to go to a discotheque, kaboom. Where am I? I mean, it's just, but there's a serious point there, of course, because the point is that another, point that always comes up with this, that this was famously broadcast. There was a showing, wasn't there, in the Pentagon during the War on Terror, 2003.
Yeah.
And I suppose I can only imagine the point that is trying to be made by that scene is that another great movie of the War on Terror era, the Team America World Police, where all the Islamic terrorists are sort of dirty-looking bearded men screaming "Darker, darker, Muhammad Jihad." But of course, that is not how these sexy women look, and I can only imagine. When they screened it in 2003, that they were trying to learn lessons about counterinsurgency and that kind of thing. But when people reel off that fact that they showed it in the context of the War on Terror, I always kind of think, well, they didn't learn the lessons, did they?
Well, I read there's a pamphlet that went with that. So it's shown in the Pentagon in 2003. There was a pamphlet that was read that it came with the screening, and it said how the French basically had a successful counterinsurgency but lost hearts and minds. What we can learn from this. And as you say, 2003, we know how that went. Did you know, I've also read as well as on the other side of things, it was also the guerrilla warfare techniques in this movie are so effective that they've been copied by the Black Panthers, Provisional IRA, Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Kashmir Liberation Front. And it's Andre Baader's from the Baader Meinhof gang. It's his favorite movie.
That doesn't surprise me.
It's that's how effective this movie is. I actually love the fact it was shown in the Pentagon. I think that's what a fantastic, what a delicious irony, I suppose. Right at the beginning of the war on independence, what a Freudian slip that was. The war on terrorism.
Well, I think this brings us
showed this movie.
This brings us. Surely we have to then talk about the context of this with serious history for a second. This is the context of 1960s decolonization, anti-colonial struggle. Congo, which we've covered before, Algeria, Cuba, Vietnam, as you've mentioned there. It's, as you say, it's about the colonizers winning the battle but losing the war, like in those other contexts, of course. It's very much that 50s and 60s period. You've already mentioned as well the visceral reaction of the militant French right, which, again, if you read into this, it's incredible. Like, the context of the fall of the Fourth Republic, the Fifth Republic then under de Gaulle under a strengthened presidency in an attempt to, to thwart the violence and threat of the people like these Pieds Noirs and these, right-wing military elements within France. So it's hard to sort of understate how much of an impact Algeria had for modern France, and the sort of decolonizing European project in the 60s. What other films capture it so well? It's great stuff.
Yes, I was looking into this. The French were colonial rulers in Algeria from 1830. I found it onwards. I found it interesting that I've talked about the French critics' response. It seems to me, and perhaps you can give us some more information on this, that shifting, winds of change, to paraphrase Harold Macmillan, era of the 50s and 60s. When this film was released in 66 and when it was shown 5 years later in France, the shift, even amongst film critics who are not the most French film critics of the 60s, I imagine perhaps not the most liberal bunch in some respects, but that attitude had shifted from one of complete derision to accepting it for what it is.
Well, I think there's an important context to mention there, and that is the a sort of really important writer who influenced, of course, this movie, and who influenced French culture and world culture was Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon writes The Wretched of the Earth in 1962, and Fanon was, he's a Francophone, he was a Martinican. He'd fought against the Nazis in World War II. He'd then gone to become an Algerian freedom fighter. And Fanon writes The Wretched of the Earth about the decolonizing process. And that comes out in 62. And I think that's a really, really important context for this movie being made and its reception. Because one of Fanon's points, Fanon was a psychiatrist. And he describes in The Wretched of the Earth how colonization is almost a process of psychological disease. The colonized are psychologically diseased, and that violence, can be the cleansing force. This isn't join hands and make daisy chains. This is. You read the first chapter. I reread the first chapter in my edition of Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. Chapter 1, titled "Concerning Violence," and he talks about how decolonization has to be violent because it's replacing. The whole colonizing project really is about replacing one species of people with another, or privileging one species of people. And he uses these sort of scientific terms, medical, sort of quasi-scientific racism, of course, which was at the heart of all these European colonizing projects. Like, it's got a very medical tone to it, that to sort of conquer the disease, you have to, violence has to be a sort of, it's going to be there because the process is being violent at the start, and it has to be overcome through another violent process. And I think, it's again a bit of a Sude's corner here, but intellectual works like that, very influential in France at this time, in terms of their cultural reception, which and the like you mentioned before, the violent then right wing imperialist reaction to all of this stuff. It's very interesting, isn't it? I do think as well, again, just to sort of go a little bit deeper into this. Why it's such a great movie is the cityscape, the Casbah. You really feel like you're there. And again, to come back to the sort of war on terror theme, the sort of thinly veiled racism and Islamophobia that we live with today, it's so clear it's so clearly made in this movie, isn't it? In the French city, there's supermarkets, and there's this sort of cleanliness and cars, and the Casbah, it's all about sort of capitalist progress versus the sort of barbaric savages, and we're still living with that, aren't we? As a justification for all kinds of wars and colonizations sort of currently going on. I do actually a lighter note here, just the lighter side of the Battle of Algiers. There's a Monoprix supermarket is featured in this movie, and I did chuckle there because one of my favourite French authors is Michel Houellebecq, who writes bleak novels about the bleakness of late capitalism, full of divorced men buying their microwave meals for one from Monoprix. But in this,
is he a divorced man who buys his microwave meals from Monoprix?
He absolutely is. But in this instance, of course, it's connoting capitalist progress, which is, of course, the whole point here. Anyway, I'm flying off in tangents left, right, and centre here. Sorry, but ground us.
Well, I would just say that, this is, again, Sue's Corner, but this is one of those wonderful movies that the sum is more than its parts. And it makes you think about many different points and strings of thought. We're not just focusing on a single character. I was watching this movie, and because I'm so used to modern Hollywood films, and we love modern Hollywood films on this podcast, big fan of them, but because I'm so used to it, I was constantly searching for a main character to follow, and the one I stopped on first was Ali Lapointe. There's this great shot of his eyes at the beginning that stay on his eyes for ages, brilliant. But then there's this French police officer who you see in two scenes, and he's working late at night, and the Algerians are up to no good again. Oh, what am I going to do? And then I'm thinking, who's this dude? Drinking his coffee and having a hard time writing up all these reports. And then him and his mates go and blow up a load of Algerians in the next scene. So okay, so it's a very interesting film that not only doesn't have a main character, but because of the human instincts, you immediately sort of want to relate to characters, irrespective of whether they're good or bad or not. And that's maybe a wider point it's trying to make. And I also was delighted to see that the music was by Ennio Morricone, and the director co-wrote the music, and some of it's fabulous. I think this is one of the rare cases where non-actors in movies really works well. But I actually remember, I just want to come back to this because we mentioned that the main character, whose name I'm going to butcher,
is there a main character?
Yasef Saadi.
Oh yeah,
sorry.
okay, right.
Sorry. Of course there isn't. So just spent 20 minutes discussing that there's no main character. The leader of the FLN was actually the leader. So he was the real bloke who did it, and very heavily inspired this film. Went on to be in the equivalent of the Algerian House of Lords. But I was remembering I was going off on a slight tangent now, but this is before anyone really was thinking about that these actors, you're basically putting these actors back in traumatic periods of their life very realistically, and no one was really interested in PTSD. But I just wanted to go off on an anecdote. When I was filming the theatre version of Touching the Void, which is a mountaineering movie. If anyone hasn't seen it, it's about a mountaineer who everyone thinks dead, and then everyone thinks has died, and then he crawls back over the space of 2 or 3 days. Incredible story of stamina and resistance. Anyway, I learned during that during the making of that film, for some of the wide shots, the reenactments, they used the guy. They used Joe Simpson, the poor bloke. He had to go back up the mountain that almost killed him and lie there. And there's a great quote from him saying, I was so traumatized by this, I thought the last 20 years were not real, and I'd wake up and I was still on the mountain. And I'm not sure if that's particularly relevant, but I often we've done 1 or 2 movies now where we've had real people who have been in these situations being put back in them, and I'm always worrying about their PTSD coming back to the fore. Anyway, talking of being sued, Bryce, I've got some information here of basically directors fawning over this movie.
Oh, there's loads. I loved some of this.
Kubrick. One can't really understand what cinema was capable of without seeing the Battle of Algiers. Werner Herzog is on his list of films that you must watch if you go to his film schools. This old Algerian film is very important for my film course.
Very good.
Ken Loach is on his list of top 10 films.
Of course it is.
Christopher Nolan says it's inspired many of his work, and I read that Ben Affleck liked it as well, but I'm not putting him in the same list of.
Well, you know, we do Sood's Corner. I mean, can we go into further into Sood's Corner here? Because
yes,
my friend and yours from The Guardian, Peter Bradshaw.
Yes, Peter.
Peter Bradshaw.
He's never far away on this podcast.
Ring the Peter Bradshaw alarm. He says, and I quote, Mathieu, so he's talking about the French commanding officer, the nearest thing probably we get to a main character, who's brought in to sort of sort out these Algerians. He says, and I quote, he looks like a cross between a top para in Northern Ireland and an IRA chief. And I read this and I thought, you know, Peter Bradshaw and some of his colleagues at the old Groniage are really, fans of mixed metaphors, which we've discussed before. I think, was it one of a Guardian review of? And by the way, I do read the Guardian. I'm not just bashing the Guardian, but sometimes the mixed metaphors are off the scale. I think were we describing Titanic? Yeah, one of Peter Bradshaw's colleagues at the Guardian said that the Titanic wasn't like the Beatles. It wasn't like
it was Essen. Yes, it was Essen.
Yeah,
correct. Yes,
but talk about mixed metaphors. You know, is Peter Bradshaw aware that the British Parachute Regiment shot 26 unarmed civilians dead, or killed, a dozen in Derry in 1972? I mean, talk about like the height of mixed. Maybe that's what he's going for here, but I think it's very clumsy if it is deliberate. But what does Peter Bradshaw know? Peter Bradford gave the a film which I think is actually of its genre, Peerless, Inglourious Bastards. He gave it 1 star. Silly Billy.
That's we've got to do Inglourious Bastards, because I think that, I know we're getting on to different topics here, I think that is simultaneous the best and worst movie I've ever seen.
10 out of 10 for me. I'll tell you now.
Really?
Absolutely. Anyway.
Wow.
Anyway,
I do like the movie. It's just some parts of it I just think, my God, it's terrible. Anyway, so should we get on to our list of questions, Bryce?
Yes, please.
Okay. So you usually answer these with either, what is it? Marlon Brando.
Marlon Brando. I've got a Marlon Brando reference.
Have you? Okay.
Yeah.
Amazing. So the Marlon Brando round. No, who is your favourite character or performance in this movie? All of them?
All of them. Yes, all of them.
Okay, good. Well, I think it's quite difficult, isn't it, to choose? I do think Jean Martin is wonderful in the role of the officer, and I love the guy who plays Ali Lapointe. He looks his character strikingly similar to him.
Yeah, I think to first of all, Matthew, the reason why he's such a compelling performance, and again, you can see how that character has played out in so many subsequent movies, can't you? But he does tell it like it is, doesn't he? To the French journalist, like, look, do you want us to stay here? Well, we're gonna have to get our hands dirty. Yeah.
Yeah, he was kicked out of the National French Theatre for signing a document along with 160 other intellectuals in 1960 in support of saying that the Algerian fight for independence was legitimate. So it's interesting he was chosen for this movie. That's probably why he was chosen. And he was also in the war in Indochina and in the French resistance, which is also what his character was in. Well, so I did read, perfectly cast.
To come back to point of characters, to come back to your previous point about not being a main character, I did read in an article that actually this was initially going to be a movie which follows the Mathieu character, or a white parachutist, into this theatre of conflict, thereby being a main character. And they had Paul Newman penciled in for it.
Wow.
Now, how much worse of a movie would it have been?
Not Mel Gibson.
If they being good, revolutionary Marxists, as Solinas and Pontecorvo, they scrapped that idea and decided to hang out smoking Gaulois with the National Liberation Front instead. And of course, it's all the better for it.
So what was your favourite scene? There's some absolute bangers in this. Literally, I suppose that's another Freudian slip. But there's just some fantastic scenes, like the kids that kill the alcoholic. Some of the post-bombing scenes, there's no music and people are going through rubble, finding these bodies. There's a scene where some French gendarmes save a boy at the races after a bombing as well. So, you were talking about the fact that the director said he's made a neutral film. I think it's clear which side you're supposed to be on, but I suppose it is It's very,
but
it's
not in a
fairly
preachy way.
even-handed.
Yeah, not in a preachy way. That's why
exactly.
it's such a good, because you're like that famous, and so, again, coming back to ink being spilled, so much ink is being spilled about that milk bar scene. But when you have that scene depicting Zora Drift and Yasif Saadi, the female bombers who plant their bombs, and I've discussed, it's male French horniness, which is their downfall there. But it's why it's such a good movie, because you're willing them to succeed. At the same time, you find yourself cheering on the fact that they're going to blow to smithereens a load of completely innocent people, including teenagers, bopping about. That's why it's such an effective scene, I think.
Yeah, and you get these shots of the victims to be, like close up shots, so which you just don't get in, that Hollywood. Maybe it's unfair just to call it Hollywood, but the Hollywood method of making films, where you have to be so invested in one character completely. The whole other half of human emotion is kind of obfuscated by that, And in this film, you get it because it's a completely different style. I also think the scene where you see the guy getting guillotined in the prison, I think that's a great scene, because you realise, my God, how brutal is this? Is this French system if they're guillotining prisoners in the 1960s?
Absolutely. Well, again, it's to do with, we're always looking at context here. This is the Italian post-war neo-realist movement. You're going to get that in literature. You're going to get that in, cinema, Rossellini, that kind of stuff. It's very influenced by that wartime struggle, the background of them in the Italian Communist Party. It's unflinching. And in line with that, my favourite scene is not actually the famous milk bar scene, although I have to say those women are stunningly beautiful. But that's
French male horniness coming up again.
French male horniness coming through here. It's not obviously not the point. But the favourite scene for me is when the lads lower the bomb in the basket, pretending it's their guns. And one of the French soldiers calls them Arab scum, and they just say, "Take this, you dog!" Kaboom! And it's rough. It's rough. It's a hard watch, but it's a great scene. The desperate, sweating lads coming towards the end of their struggle, going out with a bang. It's a great scene.
I read that killed 20 other Algerians. That the explosion that killed Ali Lapointe
really
killed 20 other people. Yeah, because it ignited a cache of bombs and blew up 20 innocent people.
Well, it's very easy these days, isn't it, to get sort of to think we're living in a woke nightmare where any scene now that's a sex scene or a kiss has to be, most films now have like an intimacy coordinator and all this kind of stuff. But then you hear stories like that and you think, my gosh, that's awful. I didn't realise that 20 people were killed for that scene.
In the history,
on purpose. Yeah. When they were filming, these people were killed.
No, in the history,
in real life.
In real life.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Well, okay. I'm not worried about that. Okay. Sorry, I thought you meant the sort of lack of health and safety was reaching staggering proportions. Sorry.
No. Okay, should have made that clear. Well, this is because this is such a documentary style. No, as far as I know, no one died on set making this movie, but I could be wrong. I don't know.
Animals harmed? Yeah, sorry, go on.
Just to change the mood, I've thought of a new question, Bryce, which I'll spring on you now. Inspired by the what part should Mel Gibson have played? It's the how would you rewrite this movie for Hollywood? If we do movies that are not Hollywood movies, how would we redo it? And I thought, what about a buddy cop comedy? Mel Gibson plays a troubled alcoholic gendarme who's teamed up with Danny Glover, playing a colonial police chief 2 weeks away from retirement. And then they have to stop the Ali Lapointe gang terrorizing the white middle classes. They get into lots of scrapes. Mel Gibson talks down the woman from detonating a bomb, with his mullet, and he's really impressed. We get like, Riggs, I'm too old for this Algerian liberation
Yeah, Danny Glover's just thinking of his retirement, maybe nice long holiday in Nice or somewhere on the French Riviera, but he keeps getting dragged back into the
with his disproportionately attractive wife.
The horror of the Casbah,
exactly. So what do you think?
Well, no, serious point. If it was going down that route, it would have been the parachute movie, the glorification of the white parachutist starring Paul Newman, which it was going to be, and which sounds utterly awful.
Who should have done the DVD commentary?
Oh, I didn't get anything for this. It was just such an assault on the senses. I couldn't even think. What did you have for this?
Well, I thought the guy we've mentioned before, Saadi Yassef, the guy who plays the head of the FLN, and was in the Algerian House of Lords until he died for a long time. Apparently,
it's his. It's adapted from his memoir, isn't it? That, it's his movie in many ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Best companion film, guerrilla war films.
Here you go. Right. So I watched a film in 2010, which was fantastic, and I think it won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. It's called Of Gods and Men. Have you seen it? It's about Cistercian monks.
No, I've seen a terrible film called Gods and Generals about the American Civil War. It's not that. No,
Of Gods and Men is about Cistercian monks up in a monastery in the Algerian mountains in the Algerian Civil War in the 1990s, which again, we haven't got time to talk about that history, but, there's a very bloody and just, when you start reading about just really, horrific history, not just in that Algerian liberation movement in the moment of the 60s, but in the 1990s, the Algerian Civil War and sectarian violence. And these Cistercian monks are effectively just sort of preparing for death, but they know they're going to be killed. I've just ruined the ending there. But of Gods and Men, it's a very good movie, and it's definitely one.
A very good movie that you now no longer have to watch, listeners, because you
know what happens there. But I've actually got another companion movie, and I haven't seen it, but I am legally required to get in reference to Marlon Brando and indeed Peter Bradshaw in all of these episodes. And Pontecorvo actually made a 1969 movie called Burn about a Caribbean slave revolt starring Marlon Brando. Have you seen it?
We've got to watch it, right?
Burn. Yeah.
69 Brando. When was Mutiny on the Bounty? That's mid-60s when he was going off the rails, wasn't it? So by 69, he must be all over the place.
This is during his barren periods when Hollywood didn't want to know. But I'd never heard of it, but I just saw it there, and I think I'm gonna have to definitely look that one up for sure.
I was thinking of guerrilla war movies, and I was thinking of The Wind That Shakes the Barley, Michael Collins, two films we should do.
Yes.
And then I thought of, Red Dawn with, when the Soviet Union invades America in the 80s.
I've not seen that.
No, it's not very good. It's with Charlie Sheen. I actually think if you like this style of movie, there's a brilliant film, I don't know if you've seen it, about Culloden, made in 1964 by a guy called Peter Watkins for the BBC, and it's a black and white documentary about Culloden, set like as if a documentary team was in when was Culloden? 1746, as if a documentary team was there, and it's a brilliant film that shouldn't work but works brilliantly. And if you like a sort of different documentary kind of style, that's like next level. That's they're like interviewing people in the middle of a battle and stuff. It's completely crazy. It's completely brilliant, and I'd recommend it. So what's going in our Hall of Fame? Keys and the electrolyte.
So many keys, man. The keys occupy
so many keys,
They're so liminal. They're so liminal. It's so damn liminal. It's very much like this movie reminded me of Star Wars. No. Silly,
well, there's a point to be made about Star Wars is just a very lazy rewriting of the Second World War.
Let's not even get into Star Wars. We're not going to do that on this. We're not going to reduce this.
Okay, all right. So one of the great little plot things I like in this movie is when Ali Lapointe gets a blank gun or a gun filled with blanks as a test for his loyalty.
I don't get that. This is to test you. I don't get the logic.
Well, hang on. He's what? I've
never got that.
Was pretty flawless.
I've never got that scene.
No,
this is to test you. Well, why?
Yeah.
Why didn't you just test him by having him waste a gendarme?
Because he could have shot the person who gave him the gun, or nicked the gun, or be an informant.
But he's not going to do that because he's been, stuck in prison, hasn't he? Actually, one of my favourite scenes is when he has the opportunity to get away at the start, and this bloody horrible little freckly white pied noir. And he just decks him instead. He's like, sorry, I'll go to prison. It's worth it. Yes.
No, but that's the thing. If they to make sure he was legitimate, because he could have, told the gendarme.
Still, I think I don't really.
Yeah, well, convince me anyway. Convince me. Don't know whether it really happened. So I thought that, or maybe the 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter piece of tiled wall that they hide behind at the end.
Oh, yeah. I've got something for Pedant's Corner.
Oh, please.
We often do this, listeners, of pedantic points. Brace yourself, we've got a good one. This is supposedly a neo-realist movie, gritty in its realism and its grainy dupe negative style and its documentary style. But actually, Ross, it's far from realistic.
Yeah.
Because those aren't French tanks.
Oh, God.
They're Czechoslovakian tanks, bought by the Algerian government post-independence. No tanks like that were ever deployed by the French army in Algeria. Thank you.
Firstly, I don't really remember the tanks, and secondly, that's military historians.
Pedantic profundities.
Yes, of course, yes, pedant.
They're Czech. They're Czech tanks. They're not.
They're Czech.
Not
okay.
French tanks at all.
Yeah, I dread to be the kind of person that is so interested in tanks and other military paraphernalia that would destroy the immersion of this film for me. So finally, Bryce, what would happen in the sequel if there was one? I think you just mentioned an interesting film about the Algerian Civil War, which I didn't even know about until you just said it just then.
Yeah, that is unfortunately the sequel to, as is often the case, isn't it, in history? Often revolution is followed by civil war, almost always, and almost always it kind of exceeds brutality in its fratricidal mayhem, which is what happens. Did you ever a lighter alternative as a sequel?
No. Or? No. Yes, I have thought of a sequel starring Mel Gibson and Danny Glover as a buddy comedy cop series.
You just mentioned
about
that.
Yes, that's the sequel.
Oh, right, okay.
I've changed it. Not a re-envisioning. It's now a sequel series.
Oh, sequel series.
It's now completely run out of steam, so it's now been brought out a series, like a series on Disney Plus, 24 episodes, and then cancelled. Right, so Bryce, marks out of 10. I've given this a 9. How about you?
Yeah, I've given it a 9 actually. It's a hard watch. Yeah. It's a very hard watch in places. Let's not beat around the bush here. This is not hungover Sunday afternoon kind of viewing, is it? It's not cuddly. It's not nice. It's brutal in its realism. But like I say, there's so many. We could talk to the cows come home, couldn't we, about how many films are indebted to the style of this movie. And so it's actually hard. It's a bit of a slog. I did find it. I've seen it before, but I did find it a bit of a slog because it's so unflinching, is it, at times when you're seeing people get mowed down, and there's so many contemporary resonances with all that stuff. But yes, definitely a 9 out of 10 for me. Really, really great movie. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think it's a wonderful movie, and I think we've basically summed it up in the last 40 minutes or so. Thanks for joining me, Bryce. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next time on the Historical Movies Podcast. That's it for this episode of the Historical Movies Podcast. Don't forget to leave us a review on your chosen podcast platform. Spotify and Apple Podcasts make a huge difference to the algorithm. And if you're on YouTube, don't forget to leave a comment or a like or subscribe. Thanks very much for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.